So Elon Musk responded to this on Twitter the other day. It's time to leave NATO and the UN. He responded, I agree. And it was at that moment, upon seeing that on Blue Sky, I realized it's over. Like, the US is over as the global hegemonic empire. And that's because someone like Elon Musk, who's clearly like driving a lot of policy these days, not just with Doge, just generally, him saying this is really significant. And we're seeing it kind of play out in Ukraine, like all the European, I guess, what they felt were assurances from the US that they would protect them, that's kind of like disintegrating. And I want to talk about this today because it's an interesting one, because obviously, if you guys have been following my channel for a long time, and I hope most people watching this will be like subscribers, because I know I'll probably get some backlash for my comments on this video. But, you know, I've said consistently the US is the most evil country in the world. I've thought that throughout the entire time I've had this YouTube channel, and it's for a variety of reasons. People often come into my mentions saying, what about Iran? What about North Korea? What about, you know, China? That one makes me laugh the most. And it's just like, I don't think Americans, because of the soft power of America and just the image of America, they really appreciate how evil the American nation state is and its impact on the world is, and how a lot of people around the world don't like America. Like, we like American pop culture, we like American, like, music, film, TV, video games. We don't like the American foreign policy establishment. That includes countries that are so-called protected by the US, like South Korea and Japan, who also often don't like the US presence in their own countries. In terms of like me thinking it's the most evil country in the world, that's not to say America is the most evil domestically, although I think Americans significantly downplay that it is one of the worst for this as well. It's more about like it domestically combined with its role in upholding like this terrible status quo around the world, and how we live in an economic system that was designed by the United States in 1944 when they created the IMF and the World Bank, and of course their general fight against the spread of socialism and communism in the Cold War period, and then of course in the 1990s where they were just at the height of their power, spreading this version of neoliberalism around the world, something that of course exploits the poorest countries for the benefit of the wealthiest ones. But at the end of the day, we all suffer under this system, and the US falling back is good for everyone, in my opinion. But I will show sympathy, and unlike a lot of people who commented in my video where I was saying that, you know, not all Trump supporters knew what they were voting for, I'm not going to blame you Americans who constantly vote for empire. I'm not happy that you're now being punished by the Trump administration. I'm not happy, and I'm not going to say, oh, well, if you didn't want this, you should have voted for left-wing parties. Like, you should have made a third party that won. I'm not going to say stuff like that, because the bad part about all of this is why I like the US retreating from the global stage. I don't like what they're doing, obviously, domestically, because they're destroying the country. And the comparison I'm going to make, not because I think Donald Trump is a Russian asset or like in league with Russian spies, like a lot of liberals, they're turning America into post-Soviet Russia. And what this means is it's like a speed run of deregulation and looting by the 1%. And that is what happened in post-Soviet Russia, where the country was so much worse off after the fall of the Soviet Union, because the IMF came in and in exchange for all these loans made them implement this free market capitalist system, which destroyed Russia and also allowed this oligarchy to form that still is in power today. And that is what we're seeing with the United States, I believe, as well. We're seeing a small oligarchy loyal to Trump getting in power and looting the country. And there is no plan for the future. And also what we're seeing with the foreign policy, like I said, as much as I like the US retreating, it's not really driven purely by some sort of libertarian ideology. It's more driven by Trump and his cronies' pursuit of profit and how to cut costs so they can make more money. Like, all this cost cutting you're seeing with Doge and what they're doing with, you know, USAID and stuff, that's not to then take it home and implement universal healthcare, is it? It's nothing rational. It's they want to cut everything so Elon Musk can get more handouts from the government. Like, he can get like more SpaceX contracts and stuff like that. And the United States government can be looted by these people, and there's more money for them to take. Not that they're all like, we should focus on making our country better first, and then we'll help out everyone else. I want to talk about all of this today, especially in regard to the Ukraine stuff. But yeah, as a left-wing person who is anti-NATO, anti-US, anti-capitalist, the US having less of an influence on the world is, I think, undisputably a good thing. And the US leaving NATO is a good thing as well. And I've said this in previous videos that if NATO is to be a purely defensive alliance in Europe, the US needs to leave. And I'd say Turkey as well. And as much as I still don't want NATO to exist, them leaving makes its existence seem to make more sense because it is focused primarily on Europe and not them having to commit mercenary forces for US foreign policy goals in exchange for US funding. So all of that coming up for you today. Please like the video, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Instagram, also at the Gamernacle on Instagram, where I'm just posting about my recent games I'm playing, and also check me out on Patreon and YouTube memberships if you want to support the channel. So I want to start with the anti-NATO thing and just elaborate a bit more, because Fox News ran an article just like outlining all the Republicans who are talking about this. So momentum is building among some Republicans and Elon Musk to withdraw the US from NATO amid stalled negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Trump reportedly floated pulling the US from the alliance during his first term, we all remember that. Senator Mike Lee has publicly backed such efforts in recent weeks and said it's time to leave the alliance after NATO countries held an emergency meeting with Ukraine in London. Lee said on Twitter that if NATO is moving on without the US should move on from NATO. What should we call the movement to get America out of NATO? America exit? Lee said on the post, it's a good thing that our NATO allies give us such favourable trade terms based on the fact that we provide a disproportionate share of their security needs. Oh wait, they don't. Lee isn't the only lawmaker. Thomas Massie also said that NATO is a Cold War relic. So the political push here, it could be driven by ideology, right? Because like Thomas Massie is this libertarian, so they don't like overseas foreign spending anyway. But I will say the Elon Musk thing is interesting. He also posted something else on Twitter, which is so funny. He writes this on Twitter. The EU leaders and Zelensky are having fancy dinners while men die in trenches. How many parents will never see their son again? How many children will never see their father? Elon, you could ask that about yourself. How many of your children will never see their father and you're not fighting in a trench? So yeah, obviously, all of this coincides with the recent disputes with Zelensky and Ukraine, and we saw that spectacle in the White House. But yeah, what we're seeing with these people is a drive to pull away from NATO. Like I said, with people like Elon Musk, I think because he is the biggest contractor with the Defense Department, I seriously think it's all about pulling funds away from stuff they don't personally think they benefit from to stuff that they will personally benefit from. When Elon Musk says this, I don't think it's driven by ideology. I think it's driven by his pursuit of more power and more profit. With the others, we are seeing a lot of people kind of want to return to this, they call it isolationist foreign policy of the United States between 1918 or 1920, whenever they left the League of Nations, and the Second World War. And if you know your history, you know the US has never been an isolationist nation. It's always been an expansionist imperial power, including in this period. But what you saw with this period is them focus more on their sphere of influence. So they didn't really care about Europe in this time. They focused more on South America, the Caribbean, and Asia. And that's what eventually brought them in to dispute with Japan, of course, not because they had a clash and they also hated fascism. It was you had two imperial powers clashing over territory in the Pacific region. Then during the Second World War, add France and Britain to that as well. And I guess that's like what we're kind of reverting back to is the US, in some regards, if it goes through this, is reverting back to its 1930 status where it's more concerned with its sphere of influence. And this does include Asia. Like, I haven't seen too much talk about the United States significantly pulling out of Korea, Japan, and getting rid of its commitments to Taiwan. I haven't seen much talk around that. So it feels like that sort of reversion of they want to focus on stuff that's closer to their borders, closer to their like direct sphere of influence, where for them, Europe isn't the direct sphere of influence because although they back these countries, they obviously have all these bases around Europe. At the end of the day, these are different nation states that kind of have autonomy from the United States, and the United States doesn't drive their policy, and they're not always reliable partners in terms of United States foreign policy goals, and they often find that more in Asia, where like South Korea is a great partner of US imperialism, probably one of the best they've had. Japan does act as this as well, and if they're trying to contain the new superpower of China, it makes sense to focus their efforts more in Asia and withdraw from Europe. Because especially after the Ukraine war, Russia is a superpower primarily for its military, which has been decimated during this conflict, and although it has good combat experience, I don't think poses a significant threat to US foreign policy goals anymore, and that's how you can read it if we're going to talk about like more like realist international relations theory interpretations of what's going on right now. But in terms of like the Zelensky stuff as well, I just want to comment on that. I think both parties knew what they were doing. I don't think Zelensky couldn't contain himself, and Donald Trump finally irritated him enough to explode right at the White House. I think the political gamble he made was, I'm going to do this and expose how much I don't have commitment from the United States government, so I get Europe to back me more. And what happened afterwards is he was tweeting or retweeting all these European leaders saying they stand with Ukraine and will give Ukraine anything it needs. Now, it does appear that it hasn't really worked, like this gamble, and even though he's got European support, a lot of the European leaders were saying, like, you have to make it right with Donald, and I did see that Ukraine are going to sign this mineral deal, but I think that just exposes to a lot of people the face of American imperialism, right? So now what we're seeing with Ukraine, that the US want the minerals, and Russia want the minerals, and they're just fighting over resources, essentially, in this proxy war. Now, people sometimes get funny when you say proxy war. Proxy war doesn't mean Ukraine are fighting on the behalf of America, right? Like, the only reason they're doing this war is to fight for America. They're not. They're fighting a self-defensive war against the Russian government. What it does mean is the US backing of Ukraine isn't for freedom, isn't for human rights, and it's never been the case. Doesn't matter if it was Joe Biden, and doesn't matter what president they have been armed under. The United States doesn't give a shit about Ukrainian independence. They give a shit about general foreign policy goals of containing Russian influence in Europe. And now it seems like the better deal is Russia doesn't really pose a threat to them, Americans, anymore. Let's carve up Ukraine's resources between each other. And sometimes what I appreciate about Donald Trump, as someone who hates America, is he just says the quiet part out loud. Like, no one can ignore it when he just says it. Like, we're just going to do this. I want Ukraine's minerals, and they're going to repay us for all the aid we've given. And I like it because then everyone can see, oh yeah, America are the bad guys. And anti-American sentiment in Europe has just gotten so insane. And you wish it would be over stuff like, arming Israel and everything they did in Gaza, rather than just like being honest for once. But at the same time, I can take either. Like, I'm happy people hate America more than they used to. It is funny though, like I'm seeing lots of posts from Americans apologizing. Like, they're saying, I am so sorry, like these maniacs are controlling our government. And I'm just thinking, it doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, you're always evil. Like, the United States nation state is always evil. Like I said, Donald Trump just puts a different flavor on it. But also, if you've been following my coverage of the Ukraine stuff, I said Joe Biden or Harris, they would have pushed Zelensky to have a deal this year as well. I don't think that has actually changed. But the isolationist flavor of this, the anti-NATO stuff, that is what's different. And there's something else I just want to add to the conversation. So we've got the anti-NATO stuff, but then also we have just written down like a little list of everything they've been pulling out from recently. And I just want to speak about like NATO in the broader context. So we have the tariffs on Canada, which apparently are being reviewed right now, but they have obviously done this, talking about taking over Greenland, pulling out from the World Health Organization, wanting better relations with Russia, wanting denuclearization with Russia and China, and obviously drastically cutting funding for US aid. So all of those things are like big changes in US foreign policy. And like I've been saying, I think most of them are for the better. So the bad part is there's lots of countries that rely on the US for other things. So like USAID, for example, right, does a lot of like good work along with all the stuff to do with like, CIA influence. But there's lots of people who rely on these programs, and Donald Trump cutting that as like an arm of US soft power, I wouldn't say might be bad in the long run, like if we're thinking about like overall, but it is bad. It's going to affect people. It's going to hurt people. It's going to kill people. But we have to, obviously, I think most countries, you have to move past a reliance on the US if you ever want to pursue interests for your own country. And that's why I think the US pulling out of NATO is a good thing, like I was saying. Although I think NATO should have been disbanded after the Cold War, we've seen now that Russia will use like drastic military force on a country like Ukraine. So the idea that there should be some sort of like defensive alliance against like a hostile country like this, primarily focused on the European Union and countries around it, I think makes way more sense then a military alliance to defend Europe where the United States is basically in charge of it and will say to these countries, come help us invade Iraq, come help us occupy Afghanistan, or like, you know what's going to happen. We're not going to fund your defense. We're not going to come to your defense. You got to do what we say. You got to be mercenaries for US imperialism, or we're not going to protect you. So taking the US out of the picture, I think, and if you would seriously want to think NATO is a defensive alliance, in my opinion, that's a good thing. And if you're talking about the nuclear element, like Britain and France both have nuclear arms and stuff. And obviously we've seen, even with the Ukrainian war, Russia's capability has always been like really, really overhyped. And if it's combating like several different groups with like way better navies, way better air forces than Ukraine, then yeah, like it feels like you don't even need the US, and the US is counterproductive to a defensive aim, if that's what we're going for. So that's a better thing. And that's something I said before. If you want to take it seriously that NATO is defensive and not an expansionist thing at the behest of the US, that's a good thing. I've seen a lot of liberals going mental that Donald Trump wants to scale back America's nuclear stockpile, which is insane. Like, that's objectively a good thing. And he said that he wants to have better relations with China and Russia, and for all of them to reduce their nuclear stockpiles. I like that. Like, why is anyone mad about that? I saw people in like liberal subreddits going absolutely crazy. I'm like, do you just want World War III or something? Do you want World War III if the US do it on like the side of the good guys or something? And World War III will be like the last war ever. So it's insane to not like this. The final one, of course, which we haven't really spoke about in this video, is the US pulling out of the UN. Now, this is something that is not in the mainstream discourse. You don't really hear many people say this. But then Elon promoting this makes me think it's maybe a conversation that's being had. And I, for one, would also be happy if the US left the UN. What I would like is if the US left, Israel would have significantly less protection in the UN. So would the Saudis. And I think that would be a good thing. But also what would probably happen as well is if the US left the UN, Israel are also going to leave the UN. And they're just going to say nothing applies to them. The same way, because they're both not members of the International Criminal Court, they just say like, yeah, this don't apply to us. So when Netanyahu goes to the US, where he would be arrested if he went to an ICC member, he goes to the US and he's fine, right? And that's probably what would happen. But to me, isolating the US more and more is a good thing. And if the US, like in terms of foreign policy, becomes more like Russia, then that's just good for the world, I believe. Because the US succeeded in the British Empire as the global hegemon and spreading capitalism even further around the world, and then after the 1990s becoming the only power basically, and what that's done to our planet, basically destroyed our planet, how much conflict that's caused, how much proxy wars have been fought, how much wars over minerals, resources, all that stuff. It's because of the US, and we're all playing in the US's game. And what would be nice if the US scaled back, it's just going to be a more, I guess, equitable relationships between like major countries. Now, what I would like with Donald Trump even saying like he wants better relations with Russia and China, that is a good thing, because these are the countries with the big nuclear stockpiles that could plunge us into another world war. So for whatever reason he's doing this, you don't have to like Donald Trump. That's a good thing for the world. You want us to be more peaceful because we have a little thing called climate change where we're all going to suffer. It doesn't matter what border we live in, and we all have to work together, and there has to be steps to reduce tensions between all these countries so we actually do work together to survive as a human race. And any steps towards that are an actual good thing. However, this is one thing I will say about the US withdrawing itself from the international scene. The one thing I'm worried about here, with them withdrawing to a less proactive role on the world stage, it feels like to me, with the new US-Russia relationship and the Saudi relationship and Russians' relationships with Saudi, Israel, and maybe even like the connection with China, I really hope this doesn't end up in we're just all controlled by one global oligarchy, which is all united. Like, that's what would happen instead. Like, it's not going to be we're all united as the human race to fight climate change. It's that, no, the oligarchy of each country have now given up their differences. So like the Saudis and the Israelis, for example, is a more recent one, where they're just going to be like, no, we're going to all work together to maximize the extraction of capital. And if we come together and reduce tensions between our nation states, there's going to be no barriers to that. Like, we will just be able to do that. And even you're seeing recently with Donald Trump making this new green card that if it costs like $5 million, we're just going to have a global oligarchy which is untouchable, and they're all going to be in it together. You saw with Mohammed bin Salman, he said to Antony Blinken, he doesn't give a shit about Palestine. That's a massive thing right now that wouldn't allow the oligarchy to join together. That's obviously what you've had with Gulf state oligarchs and the US and Israelis. It's what you've had with Russians right now and the rest of Europe because of the war. You get rid of all of that, you get rid of this tension, and you just get these people to come together, the world might be even more worse off. That's the one thing I'm worried about with the US pulling away and seemingly making more overtures for peace with like China, North Korea, Russia. It feels like it could just be like this general global oligarchy who have all just become besties. I know they are all besties anyway, but when you're taking away like all major conflict differences and everything, I don't know. So yeah, overall, the US empire ending, I'm not as excited as I thought I might be. I thought this day would never come, but we're going to watch it, you know, over the next 4 years, it's coming. And like I said, when you're watching the situation in America generally, it's horrific. Like what they're doing to America is absolutely horrific. And I'm guessing anyone who lived in Russia during the 1990s can probably relate to seeing your country basically be absolutely ransacked by capitalists. And ransacked and looted with no regard for human life. Like we're seeing all these cuts to social programs. Recently, they're talking about social security as well. And like I said, this happened in post-Soviet Russia. Life expectancy drastically decreased. I think there's like 50% unemployment. Like the life standards in the 1990s in Russia were far lower than the dying days of the Soviet Union. You know, all those things you're always told about, like bread lines and just how bad it was to live in the Soviet Union in the 80s. Well, it was even worse in the 1990s because of what they did to the Soviet and Russian state. Even as leftists and anti-capitalists, let's not get it twisted that Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and these US oligarchs, the reason they're cutting NATO funding, or they might leave NATO, the reason they're withdrawing from European politics and they want peace with Russia and everything like that, let's not pretend they're people who want to save all this money, bring it back home, and invest in America, because America needs drastic investment. It doesn't have loads of basic things most countries have. If you compare its development to even countries like China, which are far poorer, overall, it's just a bit of a joke how much more China is building up its infrastructure than a country like America. So you'd think if they can make that argument, even though I disagree with it because I think America owes a debt to the rest of the world, where it should be repairing countries it's devastated, you could understand all of this stuff. And you could maybe even agree with it as a left-wing person being like, we have so many problems back home that we need to solve. But no, that is not what's going to happen. Imperialism will continue. It's just going to be more specific. Like the US are going to massively back Israel. The US are not leaving the Pacific. They've been there for nearly 200 years. They have such a massive influence in there, and it benefits them, especially with the rise of China. I don't see the US pulling out from Asia at all. But in terms of Europe, yeah, they're just like, Europeans, you don't pay enough. You don't like fund your own defense enough. You rely on us so much. Basically get fucked and do it yourself. And it's a double-edged sword where, yes, Europeans will have to spend more on defense spending, but more independence from the US is a good thing for everyone. And I'm just sad that US citizens are going to have to suffer at the hands of these cuts where, yes, this US oligarchy is completely looting the nation, but I'm not going to pretend I'm like horrified that the US might leave NATO or something like that. Like I've wanted that for years and years. And if it happens under Donald Trump, then so be it. I'm not going to celebrate Donald Trump as a good person. He's not doing it for good reasons. Like many leftists have said, sometimes someone like Donald Trump can be good for the world generally just because of how different he is to traditional US presidents. And in his first administration, he filled it with Bush-era neocons who did business as usual. Now he's filling it, like I said, with oligarchs and random people. So they're just doing like unhinged crap that hopefully will benefit us all in the long run. And like everyone's memeing about with China, the best thing to do to become the new superpower is do nothing. Just keep your head down and get on that grind set and let the US destroy itself while you keep rising. US scaling back, good. Reasons for Donald Trump doing it, bad. And what Donald Trump's going to do with the extra cash is also bad because it's not going to the US citizens, it's just going to the pockets of the 1%. That's it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.